Good morning. I'm pleased to present the recommendations of the Materials Management Task Force on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Dr. Cindy Eisenhower from University of Maine, who was not able to join us today. The task force was established to examine how our use and waste of materials contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, and to identify strategies to reduce those emissions from the waste sector, which contributes approximately 3% to our total greenhouse gas emissions in Maine. I'd like to thank everyone who participated on the task force, including representatives from businesses and organizations that represented each rung of the waste management hierarchy. The materials management hierarchy. So we used to call it waste, right? And now we're trying to recognize that one person's trash can be another person's treasure, and that those materials that we had been disposing of, we can make better use of. So you'll hear me go back and forth between waste and materials management. So the materials management hierarchy was established in Maine's Solid Waste Act to prioritize policymaking across all stages of materials management, from waste reduction and reuse to recycling and incineration, and ultimately, lastly, preferred landfilling. I'd also like to thank Megan Mansfield-Pryor, who was staff from GoPIF, who really handled everything in terms of facilitating this task force. Many thanks to Megan. And she also served as an expert herself on the topic. And a special shout out to our youth member, Maya Fullstitch, who knows from experience that showing up really does make a difference. She was an amazing participant on the working group, and like was recognized for other youth members. Just fantastic to have somebody who's got that much energy and bright new ideas to be part of the conversation. So thanks, Maya, for joining us. So the task force recommends 6 actions to improve how we manage materials to reduce wastes and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These recommendations connect with many of the other strategies in Maine Won't Wait and with recommendations from the other working groups. They are to evaluate our consumption-based emissions, grow Maine's circular economy, reduce food loss and waste 50% by 2030, regionalize materials management services, reuse building materials, and reduce methane emissions. We were new, so we had lots of recommendations. We had a lot of pent-up energy and interest in materials management. We had to boil it down quite a bit just to get to these 6. So I'm going to go into a little more detail on each of these, but there's so much more supporting information behind all of them that will be accessible to the Climate Council members as you're considering these recommendations. So we've traditionally measured Maine's greenhouse gas emissions as those that are directly emitted within Maine's borders, otherwise known as our territorial emissions inventory. That's the one I referred to earlier, where we've achieved a 30% reduction since 1990. However, that method doesn't take into account many of the actions we take in Maine that affect other parts of the country or the world that do contribute to the global problem of climate change. So for example, when you choose to reuse a container that was made in China, that does reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not counted in our inventory. Our collective consumption choices can have a meaningful impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and the task force recommends that moving forward, we also use a consumption-based inventory method to help us evaluate the greenhouse gas benefits of our material management strategies. The task force also strongly recommends strategies to promote a circular economy, where the value of materials is retained by reusing and recycling them for as long as possible to reduce the need for virgin materials. This includes supporting investments in reuse and refill infrastructure, such as container collection systems and washing facilities, which will also expand job opportunities. The state's Lead by an Example initiative should include procurement policies that give preference to reusable rather than disposable materials, and state funding should incentivize reuse and recycling over destruction of materials through incineration or landfilling. This will reduce both our territorial emissions and our consumption-based emissions. And I would also like to give thanks to the GoPIF staff and to the folks from the Augusta Civic Center. Just a shout out that you may recall from years ago when we did these events, we had lunches in boxes and huge piles of materials that were wasted at the end of these events. We're now using reusable coffee cups. We've got hot food that's going to be served on plates that will be washed, and also any of the food that's not consumed today will be donated to the Augusta Food Bank. So great change that we've made. The task force recommends setting a specific, aggressive goal to reduce food loss and waste 50% by 2030. DEP did a recent study of food loss and waste, and we found that the largest contributors to food waste are, no surprise, residences, our own homes, food manufacturers, grocery stores, hotels, and restaurants. Greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced from the waste sector by maximizing food rescue and donation efforts, which will require increased education and outreach. We know that this is something that there is still some discomfort with. There have been changes to state policies to make sure that people understand this is something that can be done safely, but we want to continue to promote those efforts. This recommendation also aligns with Maine Won't Wait's recommendation that we should be working to feed hungry people. The distances between Maine's communities cause increased costs for and emissions from the transportation of wastes. Southern parts of Maine have more access to reuse and recycling services than the northern half of the state. The task force recommends increased coordination among local and regional facilities to scale up waste prevention and diversion services. And similar to recommendations from the Buildings Working Group, the task force recommends that building materials should be reused when possible to retain their embodied carbon through redevelopment or deconstruction rather than demolition. The task force also recommends planning for the impacts of storms on our built environment by establishing systems to collect storm debris and locations for the storage to sort it. And lastly, the task force also examines strategies to reduce emissions from landfills, which are reflected in Maine's greenhouse gas inventory. Landfills emit methane from decomposing wastes, which can be captured and used as an energy source. However, this is not a renewable energy source, and the task force recommends reevaluating if the use of renewable energy credits is really an appropriate incentive for gas capture. So as I said before, this is a really brief summary of very lengthy and detailed recommendations with lots of supporting information about materials management in Maine. So I hope for all of you who have an interest in the topic, you will review that. And I did not use all my time.
Wow.